Hi everybody, it's great to see you all here for this webinar, and I'm hoping to be able to be as interactive as possible and for all of you to be able to ask as many questions as you can as we go through today's session. So I'm really proud to be able to present this research to you, Generation Now, Understanding and Engaging Jewish Teens Today. It's been a labor of love of mine for the last year and a half or so, and it's culminating a lot of different research that we've done, which you're now able to find up online in the following booklet. I'm giving you the URL now for this website because you might want to refer to it during the actual presentation as well. So if you're able to log in on another screen, that might help you as well. All of the research I'm presenting today is made possible by the support of following foundations: the Jim Joseph Foundation, the Lippman Camp Foundation for Living Torah, the Charles and Lynn Schussman Family Foundation, and the Marcus Foundation. And of course, the Jewish Education Project is sponsored as a beneficiary agency of UJA Federation of New York. I do want to actually be very clear here in saying that these funders are not only funding financially the work that we're doing, but they are also partners with us, and partners make this work possible. And that's an important point to make at the start of doing any research, that you do need to know that the investment necessary is really important. So today's webinar, we're going to cover three major components of the work. The first is going to look specifically at Jewish teen outcomes. We're then going to look at some of the ancillary research findings, which are really important as well, and they make up the bulk of the actual report that's online. And then we'll have a brief look at the implications of the research today. I will ask at the end of every section if there are questions that I will try and answer. So if you want to try and ask them any time during the webinar, go ahead and do that, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. So just to get us going, I want you to think of the following question, which I think is a really good starting point for us today. So what are the outcomes for Jewish teens that you are currently being held accountable for? Now, I recognize that not everybody on this webinar is coming from the same sort of setting, but if you were involved in Jewish teen engagement, what are the types of outcomes that you would think people are currently being held accountable for? If you want to answer in the chat box, go for it. If you want to just think about it yourself, you can do so. And I'll give you a couple of minutes just to write down as many different things as you can think of. I want to come back to your answers in a second, but I do want to lay the foundation for this work, which is coming from almost a position of deficit. And deficit meaning that in the Jewish community today, there is a large drop-off rate post the age of bar from organizational Jewish life. And this graph has been produced by the Jim Joseph Foundation using an amalgamation of a whole lot of data to try and show how many teens are engaged in Jewish life today in the following major programs of Jewish teen engagement. So we estimate there are somewhere between 330, some people say as high as 450,000 Jewish teens today, and you try and segment that population, and you look at the numbers involved in youth groups, in high schools and supplementary schools, Hebrew highs, overnight camps, and teen travel to Israel, and you look at those numbers, and some of you might say, well, these numbers are pretty high. Some of you might say they're pretty low. What you do need to take into consideration, and many of you will know this, that many of these Jewish teens are duplicates or triplicates, i.e. they appear in many of those different settings. This table is important because it basically says to us that quantity is a major issue for Jewish teen engagement, i.e. we do want to attract more Jewish teens into Jewish institutional life. But when I asked you the question earlier of what are the outcomes for Jewish teens that you're currently being held accountable for, I can't accept, and neither can the foundation who are responsible for this research accept, that numbers and enrollment are the only things that are actually important. Now, we're going to make this webinar available to all of you after today's session, and also the report is also going to be made available to you afterwards, and it's currently there online. And we're asking the question of what can you actually use and how can these implications be useful for you. But this is an important starting point. Now, the actual research that we conducted was specifically looking at the outcomes and indicators of how we're going to engage Jewish teens. And this was developed along a process which was looking at 10 local initiatives across the country, and it was going to be used in a way that we could test whether the interventions taking place in those communities were actually achieving the goals they wanted to do. So it was assessing the impact of teen programs across diverse settings. The research that we conducted involved a large literature review, also available online, interviews with field professionals, researchers and funders, and then a large amount of qualitative research, including digital ethnography, focus groups, and interviews with some of their Jewish parents as well. Again, all of this is available for you to have a look at. What we came up with was a major shift in what we're calling a paradigm shift in Jewish education and Jewish learning today for teenagers today. The majority of Jewish teen engagement up until now has looked at the question of what can we do to these teens? Or, as an institution, what are we doing to help make these teens do something more, or make them better, or make them improve, whatever that qualification might be. But it was really treating the teen as a recipient of those interventions. The paradigm shift that we're putting forward is not looking at what we can do to that teen, but how can we understand the teen as a whole person? And therefore, the question we're really asking is, how can we ensure that Jewish learning expands them as full human beings, as full people? The new framework is developed along a taxonomy which says there are core questions that teenagers are asking. And those 4 questions are, who am I? With whom am I connected? To whom am I responsible in this world? And how can I bring about change in this world? And we understand that those 4 questions are things that all teenagers are asking. Now, it's not as if they're walking down the street asking themselves these questions all the time. But in their existential moments, or in the moments when they're trying to assess what will make me a better human being, these are the questions that teenagers are actually engaged in. To help us move better down in terms of the framework, we then developed 8 different dimensions, and you can see here what we're trying to get at is a way of better understanding, is intervention X having these particular outcomes for these teens? And the 8 dimensions lay themselves out: the dimension of self, the dimension of knowledge, time, of human connectedness, the spiritual dimension, communal, Jewish people, and the global dimension. Now, once we developed this taxonomy, we were then able to send off all of this work to some people who were able to develop a survey instrument which is currently being tested in the field today. And what's being tested now is a series of outcomes, 22 in total, which try and get at ways to evaluate whether those core questions are actually being answered. So, for example, when you're trying to work out, is the self dimension of a teenager being impacted, you're asking questions of, do Jewish teens have a stronger sense of self as a result of that experience? Or do Jewish teens have a sense of pride about themselves as a result of that experience? Now, if you begin to have a look at all of these outcomes, you might notice something really different from what we're used to, and that's the paradigm shift we're talking about. We're not asking questions, did you become more Jewish as a result of that experience? We're not asking, are you more likely to light Shabbat candles? Are you more likely to attend synagogue? Are you more likely to become a member of a JCC? Are you more likely to make Aliyah or ultimately to marry someone Jewish? No, they're not the questions we're asking ourselves anymore. We're not asking the questions of, will you do something differently or better because we want you to do that. We're asking, as a human being, have your experience of life been enhanced as a result of these interventions? Put another way, are you going to be a more successful human being as a result of taking part in these Jewish experiences? In the language of positive psychology, are you more likely to flourish as a human being as a result of these experiences? So we continue to ask questions of Jewish teens who have experienced learning that has been both challenging and valuable. Not that they're learning something for learning's sake, but is it actually encouraging them to be challenged and valued as they move through their life experiences? Are they learning things that enable them to be more active participants in Jewish communities? Are they learning more positively about the experiences associated with Jewish holidays and Shabbat? Are they establishing strong friendships? Are they establishing strong and healthy relationships with their families? Are they developing strong and significant relationships with their mentors, role models, and educators? Are they able to express their values and ethics in relation to Jewish principles and wisdom? And in terms of the spiritual dimension, are they able to develop the capacity, both the skills and the language, that allow them to grapple with and express their spiritual journeys? We then go on to ask, are they more connected to their various communities? Not just their Jewish community, but all of the communities. Are they developing a desire and commitment to be part of the Jewish people now and in the future, getting at the Jewish peoplehood dimension? Are Jewish teens developing a positive relationship with the land, people, and state of Israel, whatever that positive relationship might be? And are Jewish teens inspired and empowered to make a positive difference in the various communities and the world in which they live? Now, just to give a bit of background, the teens involved in this research were the ages between 13 and 17, and they were mainly sociological distinction of age that we developed, because at a time when kids are post-B'nai Mitzvah and are still in high school. There were teens that were both low engaged and high engaged in the Jewish community, and there were teens from 5 communities across the country that we thought gave a good representation of Jewish teens in North America in general. The majority of these teens were interacted with via focus groups, and they also gave us some digital information as well in advance, responses to questions, and also some images they were drawing and giving to us as well. So it's a pretty solid sample of teens that lead us to come to these overall analysis of Jewish teens today. Now, this is a lot to throw at you all at once, but if you've got access to a web browser, you can have a look on jewishedproject.org Generation Now, and you can begin to have a look at these in a table format, which gives you a greater sense of where they are. And the question that you need to begin to ask yourselves are, do these outcomes resonate with you? And when I say you, I'm assuming that most of the people on this webinar are somehow involved in Jewish teen engagement. And when you're thinking about these questions, I want you to actually really understand, are these things that you grapple with? Are they things that you are not used to thinking about? What's missing from this list? If you were to add things, what would you be adding? Or if you were to frame things differently, how would you be framing? This is a particularly important question, because now we're in the process that we've developed all these outcomes to a survey instrument that's currently being trialed and tested around the country with various groups of Jewish teens today. And it does raise for us a really important secondary question of, are these outcomes designed to be descriptive or prescriptive? Excuse the spelling. And this is an important question because we're actually trying to balance here, and I want to try and be a bit nuanced here. This wasn't as if we were going to the teenagers saying, where are teenagers at today, and develop outcomes that suit exactly where they are. We were trying to develop outcomes that met teens where they are, but also acknowledge that as Jewish educators, we were trying to take them on a trajectory. But importantly, this is back to the paradigm shift. The trajectory is not one which we predetermine. Our primary objective here is not to become more members in a certain organization. Our primary objective here is to look at the unit of the teenager as a whole and say, what is best for that teen? Given the trajectory that they are on, what can we do to enhance their journey? And in that way, we are in some ways describing through these outcomes where we see Jewish teens today, and we'll go into a bit more of the research in a second. But we are also suggesting that given what we know about Jewish teenagers today, and given where we would like to see Jewish teen engagement move in the future, that in some way, somehow, these outcomes might also become prescriptive for you as well. That when you begin to design Jewish teen programs, that you begin to keep some of these outcomes in mind, no matter what they are. So instead, for example, of asking, what knowledge do I need my teenagers to know in order to be a better Jew today? You're asking the question of what knowledge do I want my teens to know in order that they can make it more relevant and meaningful and purposeful for their life moving forward. They're two fundamentally different questions. The first one is, what's the canon of Jewish knowledge that you think they ought to know? The second is, what information are they better off knowing in order that they can succeed? Now, there is a negative here, and the negative could be construed as, well, aren't we just catering for the narcissism of today's generation today? And I want to acknowledge that, and I don't really have a sufficient answer for that, except to say that we need to acknowledge where our learners are at, where our teens are at, because if we don't acknowledge the starting point of people in the 21st century is themselves, then we're fighting a much larger battle than all of us have been able to do in the past. And the alternative, we know, doesn't work for these teens today. Okay? The alternative of saying, this is what you ought to know, you can choose it or reject it, we know what's happening. Based on the graph I showed you earlier, many more are rejecting it. So I'll pause here for a bit after having presented these outcomes to you. I know it's a lot of information, so you can go back to the website if that helps you, and try and see if there are any questions that I want to try and answer in this breaking point. So you can, in the chat box, you might want to ask a few questions. Someone's asked about a question or a hierarchy with these outcomes, and I would like to say that we're not at the stage that we're prepared to say to a specific organization that you need to be doing one of these more than the other. If you're an organization that doesn't deal with Israel, then you might ignore, for example, the outcome on Israel. Or if you're an organization that really is not about the acquisition of knowledge, then you might be having a less of a relevance or resonance with that one. But I do want to say that there are some things which we are becoming closer to saying which are almost like essential elements. And these are particularly the outcomes which talk about the self. If your initiative does not give your teen a stronger sense of self, a higher sense of resilience, a larger understanding of their own self-esteem, if your intervention does not create a social environment where they're able to develop friendships, if your intervention does not pay attention to who the other people are in that room, what relation they have with mentors, what relationship they're having with senior educators or other people in that environment, we are basically saying that teenagers will not come to your experiences because they do not value what you're actually offering them, because they don't resonate with them as human beings today. So this move now becomes really important, and we'll talk about this in a few seconds when we move on to some of the other research. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on now to the actual research, and the research is important because it helped us to actually come up with some of these things as well, but it did also enable us to broaden our understanding of who Jewish teens are today. And the actual report in Generation Now actually focuses a lot on this research as well. I'm going to move on to the handset, and maybe that can help some of you with the feedback. So here are a couple of things about Jewish teens which are really important for us to understand. And the number one thing that we hear when we're talking about teenagers today in the 21st century is that they are busy. And the teens today are multitaskers and able to do many, many things at the same time. So, maybe, hang on one second. I don't know how to do this. Disconnect it completely. So I'm going to continue here, and we're going to keep going here without my pretty face. So the issue of teenagers being really busy is really important, but I do want to be quite categorical here, and this is really important for us to understand. Everybody tells us that teenagers are busy. And in some cities, people say they're even busier than other cities. But I do want to be really important here and say that Jewish teenagers are busy doing something. They're not busy doing nothing. And I say that as a really important point because it means that in the age of choice, teenagers are actually choosing things that they value more than other things. And the number one thing we heard about Jewish teen engagement over and over again is that when they are actually offered things that offer them a sense of accomplishment, a sense of pride, that engage them intellectually, physically, and socially, when they're offered interventions where they are developing skills and talents that they see positively impacting their lives both in the present and the future, they are taking advantage of those activities and interventions. That's not a statement about Jewish interventions. That's a statement about the interventions that they're taking place in their lives in their totality. And that is really important for us to understand. Please note, I have not written that they are trying to build their resumes in order to get into college. Yes, that is important, but just be careful. It's actually usually more important to their parents than the kids. When the teens are actually responding to these questions, they are saying categorically that it is the resume of life which they are trying to fill. And what fills the resume of life are all of the positively impacting things that we can offer them. And think about it now for yourselves. Are the interventions that you're offering your teenagers challenging them? Are they giving them a sense of accomplishment? Are they proud about coming to the interventions that you offer? There's another really important piece here about what it means to be a teenager today. A teenager today in the world, and a Jewish teenager as well specifically, thinks of themselves as a global citizen. They think of themselves as a person in the world at large, and yet, at the same time, they also see themselves as a member of the tribe. And this is really important. And this emerged a lot during the research that we were conducting. That these Jewish teenagers were divided amongst those that we would consider and call them as particularists, i.e. those who look at the world through a Jewish lens. As one said, even if I dislike some of my fellow Jews, I feel like I have to stand up for them if people are treating them in a mean way because we're the same, we're connected. And then you have teens which see themselves in a universalist set. The reason they're Jewish is to try and make the world a better place. Obviously, I'm horrified at what happened. In this case, they're referring to the events which took place in France with the killings inside the Charlie Hebdo and also in the kosher Jewish supermarket. But I don't know if I necessarily feel worse because they were Jewish. I feel like all human life should be valued as the same because the loss of any life is awful regardless of whether or not they're Jewish. And you had these two distinct attitudes coming from these Jewish teens. On one hand, you had them saying, like, my worldview is very much associated with what it means to be a Jew in the world today. And on the other hand, you had a sense of these kids who were saying, my sense of being Jewish in the world today is about being a universalist. And my notion of wanting to make the world a better place is central to whom I am. And they went further. They said, do not try and make a program seem as if it's specifically designed to affect and reach out to just teens, because that's discriminatory, if not racist. And to be honest and to be totally upfront, and the data shows it out, and you'll read it in the research, the more higher connected teens, the ones that had more affiliation to Jewish organizations, who participated more in Jewish life, were more likely to be particularists, where the lower connected teens were very rarely going to be particularists in their outlook on the world. And here got us to a conundrum. And here was the chidush. Here was the newness of this research. In the past, we've actually made a distinction between Jewish kids as either one or the other, universalists or particularists. And now we're able to see something different, that they're not mutually exclusive. And in fact, in most cases, teens were able to be both global citizens and members of the tribe and able to move between those two different identities at a very dramatic rate. It confused us at times because you didn't understand how one kid could say something and then say exactly the opposite a few minutes later. But in their minds, they were able to be both of these things. Very important when developing programs. We can talk about the implications of that moving forward. I want to move on to Jewish knowledge because I think this is a really important piece for us to emphasize as well. In the vast majority of cases, Jewish teens were only interested in acquiring Jewish knowledge that they could immediately see the personal, meaningful, and most relevant aspects of that knowledge. This is important. The notion of a teen learning for learning's sake, what we refer to often as Torah Lishma, is really, really something which the teen in the 21st century cannot relate to. And therefore, any type of intervention we're offering, whether it was their Jewish education or their learning for their bar or bat mitzvah, that it needed to be equated with something which was personally meaningful and relevant. This could get back to your acknowledgement earlier on about the narcissism of today's generation. I accept that, but I also want to accept that when learning is done best, it also needs to be based in an understanding that it is relevant for these kids' lives today. This related directly to one of what we thought were the biggest misconceptions that we uncovered in this research. That about the bar and bat mitzvah. That when you see the data earlier on and you see the dramatic drop-off rate that occurs in Jewish life after the bar or bat mitzvah, you could actually come to the conclusion that it's the bar or bat mitzvah which is at fault. That it's leading these kids up to a tipping point of Jewish life, and as soon as they accomplish that tipping point, they leave Jewish life, and they want to have no sense of connectedness to the Jewish organizational world or anything that offers them any positive Jewish experience. And yet, when we spoke to these teens, even the least connected, and the most connected, but the least connected who had a bar or bat mitzvah, not the ones that didn't have, that's another category, but the least connected who still had a bar or bat mitzvah, they saw it as a source of pride, of accomplishment, that it connected them to Jewish life. For the higher connected teens, it was clearly a newly acquired Jewish responsibility in a synagogue. But even for the lowest connected kids, it was a sharing of the event with family and friends and a demonstration of skill that they had learned, which they saw as something to be proud of. Remember from before, skill, accomplishment, challenge, performance. And especially they enjoyed sharing these Jewish traditions with their non-Jewish friends. And this uncovered a whole new area of understanding. That to be Jewish in the world today, at least in the eyes of the vast majority of teenagers, is an extremely, extremely positive experience. It's not just the Pew Report which reports that pride in Judaism is a major sense of belonging and identification with being Jewish in the world today. But these teens were saying it as well. And here you need to understand two important points. One, America today is a very tribal country. Many people develop and have connections with their ethnic, cultural bonds. And the Jewish teens were describing their Jewishness not only in religious terms. In fact, very few of the lower connected teens were describing Judaism as a religious connection. They were describing it using the same language of other ethnic and cultural groups. And I want to put out there that one of the biggest things we're seeing now shifting is the acknowledgement sociologically that to be Jewish in the world today is far more than just a religion, but is clearly an ethnicity, a culture, and part of being a tribe. And the question you should ask yourself from that become really important. And here we see the bar and bat mitzvah. Let's not look at it as a negative, but really begin to hone in on it as a positive experience and something which can be seen as a launch pad for other activities and involvement in Jewish life today. When we ask teens about their major experiences and their major connections with Jewish life, food and holidays came up over and over again. Holidays are a source of connection. Why? Because of the bond that they represent with immediate family, extended family, and they enjoy the passing down of family traditions. By far, the four most common or most prevalent Jewish holidays were or are Hanukkah, Pesach, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. Some teens, most of the higher connected teens, found other levels of meaning in the history behind these holidays and connections to a larger community and the feeling that holiday celebration lifts one above the daily routines. But even the lower connected teens saw these holidays as a way to connect with other Jews, including their family, but also their family traditions and the traditions of their people. Family and food, I cannot emphasize enough, became really important hallmarks and benchmarks for participation in Jewish life for these teens. When delving a bit further, though, the word spirituality, which is prevalent in a lot of the literature about adolescence today, became far more problematic. The term spirituality did not resonate with most Jewish teens. And yet, this did not mean that our teens are not spiritual. Most teens agreed that you can be spiritual without being religious. This is a lot of stuff which reflects literature coming out of other religious movements in America today. And now we're beginning to uncover it in the Jewish world as well. That traditional Jewish concepts of God, prayer, holy times and spaces were things that people were beginning to reject. And they were turning more to nature, to meditation, and influenced more by secular American culture as a way of representing their connection to Jewish life. For me, this slide here represents one of the biggest challenges to organize Jewish life in America today. That most of American connection has been built around the connection towards synagogue and Judaism as a religious affinity. Now we have a major challenge being spilled out in front of us before our eyes. And the teens express this on many occasions, similar to this meme. Religion is a person sitting in church thinking about kayaking, and spirituality is a person sitting in a kayak thinking about God. I do want to be very clear here. We're not saying that kids do not believe they are part of something bigger than themselves. The opposite. They feel very much connected to a broader being, a broader universe. But they are saying outright that the language, that the institutions, that the liturgy, and even the role models that we are offering them are not able to access that within themselves that allows them to connect to this higher being. I want to focus a bit on the concept of doing good. Doing good is a value that we in the Jewish community hold very dear to us. And there's a trend in the Jewish world today, especially in teen engagement, to focus a lot on doing good as a major imperative of Jewish teen life. Some of you call it tikkun olam, social action, community service. We found that almost every teen contributed to society and affect in a positive change way. This was not because it was a requirement for them to graduate from high school. These teens, this generation of teens, feel that they are imbued with a power and a desire and a will to make the world a better place. However, they struggle to find a Jewish language to express those views. They are sometimes uncomfortable with the particularism that concepts like mitzvah and tzedakah and tikkun olam actually imply. Why do you assume that only Jews want to make the world a better place? Many of them asked us. And the more universalist mindset they would tell us over and over again was that they are committed to improving the world, or that doing good is a personal choice not dependent on religion. They were saying over and over again that every religious group, every faith group, or every group designed to get kids together, kids are talking about their scout and their guide groups as well, whatever it might be, are trying to make the world a better place. But there was an acknowledgement here of a failure of Jewish language or a failure of Jewish connectivity here to actually express that as a Jewish value. Now, I don't know if that's important to you or not. I'm just saying up until now, we haven't done a good enough job of being able to do this good through a Jewish lens or through Jewish values. And simply by adding a pasuk, a verse, or a Jewish value as a label onto some sort of action does not make it in their minds a Jewish action. In fact, they often see it as being quite disingenuous. The last point in the research that I want to raise is is sometimes referred to as the third rail of Jewish life today. I want to make a bit of just a mild reference to it. I think it's important enough for actually just to highlight, and that's the connection to Israel. For the higher connected teens, Israel is a source of pride and connection and meaning and something they have a close spiritual connection to. It's almost synonymous for the vast majority of teens that are highly engaged in Jewish life, that Israel is part and parcel of their commitment to being a Jew today, is their connection to actually being involved with Israel in whatever capacity that might entail. However, and this is really important, the vast majority of teens today who are less affiliated or not affiliated still have a perception of Israel. It's not built through any organizational affiliation. But you cannot be a teen today in the world, especially of the socioeconomic class that we're talking about with most of the Jewish teens in North America, and not have heard about Israel in some form or other. And these kids, who by and large are liberal, small L liberal, on almost all issues in the world today, whether it be abortion, gun rights, immigration, and who they're going to vote for in the next election that they're possibly able to vote for, are also liberal on issues related to the Middle East and the Middle East conflict. And this is important, because when you couple that with an innate disdain for hierarchy institutions, which is pervasive amongst Generation Z anyway, you have a whole generation of Jewish teens that are forming a very much a universal and liberal mindset when it comes to Israel. And it's no wonder that they're rejecting many of the more hardline or right-wing attitudes towards Israel when presented to them. I'm putting that out there because I know it's a major issue for many of you, and I know it's something that we need to grapple with. So what I've done now is I've outlined about 5 or 6 of the major points that have been raised in the Generation Now research report, and they all offer different challenges for us as educators and communal professionals when we're considering how to engage Jewish teens today. If there are any questions that people would like to ask, please do so in the chat box, and I'll be happy to try and answer as many of them as we possibly can before entering into the final section of this research. So I'm not going to hang out too long in silence on a webinar, because that can be almost as frustrating as anything else. But here comes some questions which are really important. So some people are getting into the methodology, and we've outlined a whole lot of the methodology online. All in all, there are over a couple of hundred of teenagers that were involved with in the qualitative research as well, and now we're beginning to validate the survey instrument with thousands of teens across the country as well. In the study, there was no real way of us to be able to identify high and low connected teens other than to look at those which have a connection or multiple connections to Jewish organizations. And while we realize that that is not perfect, we needed to understand some benchmark. So those kids that had multiple connections were clearly high. Those kids that had no connections or few connections or mild connections, we regarded as being low. Someone's asked a question about the Shoah, which is the Holocaust, which is really important for us to look at here. And I'll spend a couple of seconds on, especially acknowledging this week is Yom HaShoah. And I would say that this was one of the more surprising findings in our research, and yet when we understood it a bit further, it became something which we were sort of like, we should have not been as dismissive going in. And that was that these teens, the lowest connected and clearly the highest connected, had an extremely strong connection to the Holocaust. There were multiple reasons for this which are worth spending a couple of minutes on. One, in a time when minority groups in the country are generally seen as being either dominant or persecuted, for many teens the Holocaust was a sign of the persecution that our tribe has been through, not as a sign of being submissive, but almost as a sign of being proud that our ethnic group has overcome this form of persecution. They were the more particularist kids. And the Universalists were saying the Holocaust is really, really important, not so much because of what happened to us as a people, but because of what happened to us, we are now able to advocate for greater human equality in the world at large. And it was both the particularists and the Universalists which had a strong connection to a Holocaust, and we thought going into this generation might have been desensitized to the Holocaust experience moving forward. There's something else which is really important sociologically to understand, is the vast majority of these teens in countries all around the country are actually studying some form of the Holocaust in either English or social studies classes all around, whether it's by looking at Elie Wiesel's Night or by looking at the diary of Anne Frank. So if you can imagine you're the only kid in the class somewhere, Jewish kid in the class, and you're talking about Anne Frank, then all of a sudden your Jewishness and the Holocaust experience related to you actually becomes more highlighted in that setting as well. Very important for us to acknowledge. Someone's asked the question here of implication about spirituality and organized religion question. Is attachment to traditional Jewish language about spirituality important to teens, or should we just try to give them nature and meditation in a Jewish way? So here's where I don't want to get too prescriptive here, but I do want to add another element that we haven't spoken about much before today, and that is the element of choice. These kids need to feel like they have a choice in almost everything that they do, and prescriptive liturgy, almost by definition, takes away choice. The other element which is really important is that of empowerment. These kids want to feel like they are empowered to live the lives that they want to lead. And therefore we're seeing a huge response of kids that are very interested in writing their own prayer services, developing their own rituals, whatever that might be. We see that in summer camp. How is it possible the same kid loves Shabbat at summer camp and dislikes when they go back to their congregation back home? And we believe a large amount of that is due to the fact that the language offered to them at home is not their language. It's not their ritual. Where at camp, at least they feel the sense of ownership of the prayer services that they are taking part in. Was there a diversity of Jewish density studied in the sample, and the difference here between urban areas? Yes, I would say there was diversity in density, but not enough diversity that we were, not enough. And you are right in asserting that there are differences institutionally when there is a higher or lower density of Jews in a particular area. But what I want to push all of us to here really today is to understand the fundamental questions that these teens are asking themselves or of themselves. The questions of who am I, with whom am I connected, to whom am I responsible in the world, how I can bring change in this world, are not dependent on density and not dependent on the institutions. That they are actually fundamental questions that all teenagers are asking. And that is something which I want to emphasize here a lot. Some of you are saying here, which is important, that what I'm talking about today is not just about general teenagers, but it's also about general older demographics as well. You may or may not be right. I do not have at my disposal now the other surveys on the other generations, but you are correct in that there are a lot of connections here, at least between millennials and Generation Z or teenagers today, and some would argue people even older. I'm watching the time. Please feel free to ask more questions, but I do want to get to the crux here, which is important as well for me as well, of what are the implications of this research. So I'm trying not to be hyperbolic here. I'm trying not to overstate the importance of this research, because until it plays itself out, we won't fully know what the actual implications completely are. But we deliberately use the word groundbreaking in the way we describe today's research and the webinar today. Not because the research we uncovered, not because of the conversations we had, not because of the qualitative differences that we discussed, and that you can read all about in the report, but because of the paradigm shift that we're pushing forward. I don't just say this lightly. That when we understand the child as a whole person, and we look towards Jewish learning expanding them as a person, as a human being, that is fundamentally different to the way that most Jewish educational experience for teenagers have been conceived of in the past. I'm only repeating myself for emphasis here. In the past and in some of the locations today, Jewish teen engagement has been designed to make teens become better Jews, has been designed to make them participate in more Jewish behaviors, to make them specifically do more things in order that the Jewish community, the Jewish building, the Jewish institution, or the Jewish people be a stronger people. And the paradigm shift here is quite clear, that if you are going to follow a line like that, and that your objective is to make these Jewish teens be more of that, then you will only ever reach a certain number of those teens. But if your objective is to reach a larger group of Jewish teenagers today, you better understand who these teens are and what types of interventions are going to engage them more in Jewish life today. And those are questions that fundamentally look at how you are going to expand them as people, increase their as citizens of the world, that Judaism is a part of their identity and not their only identity, that you acknowledge that they have diverse friendship groups, that you see that family is a primary source for their Jewish identity, that you see Judaism as a source of connection and not the end game in itself, that you acknowledge that they are busy lives with various and meaningful interests, that you acknowledge that they're feeling unique and different because they're Jewish, not in spite of the fact they're Jewish, and they're seeking life-relevant skills and experiences. And then when you get involved in designing experiences for Jewish teens, that you keep these teen-centered questions in mind, not because you're going to treat them as narcissists, but because you're going to acknowledge that meeting learners where they're at is what education has always been or should always have been about. How will this engage me intellectually, physically, and socially? How can I share this with my friends, Jewish and other? How can I apply this intervention to my entire life? How will this help me develop skills that will benefit my life? How will this help me feel proud of being Jewish? How will this help me be a better citizen of the world? How will this help me make the world a better place? These are all the questions that you need to be focusing on when you're developing interventions for Jewish teenagers today. There's a question which is asking me about the teens offering suggestions. If they're seeking empowerments, what do they want the organizations to be doing? Did any of them offer concrete suggestions in any realm? Again, I don't want to get too specific here, but I want to say that virtually every teen that we spoke to was a highly engaged teen. They might not have been a highly engaged teen in Jewish activities, but almost all of them were involved in doing many other things in their lives. And when we asked them why, they gave us the answers that all of us as youth professionals are looking for. When you gave them authentic leadership roles, where they were actually involved and empowered to actually bring about change, they would get involved. And you've got to remember, this is a generation of teenagers who understand that if they want to bring about change in the world today, they can do so at the click of a button in almost any sector of their life, except, unfortunately, in their words, when they are treated as children in Jewish institutional life. If you treat them like children, they will act like children. And if you want them to save the world, believe me, they know, probably better than many of us on this call today, how they can go about doing that. Did I ask them the question about whether it's important for them to marry someone Jewish or not? No. We did ask them the question of where they saw themselves in 25 years' time. And overwhelmingly, even the least connected kids told us that they saw themselves raising a family based on some sort of Jewish values, no matter what that would be. That didn't mean they would always marry a Jew. For that was almost an irrelevant question. But they saw themselves raising families with Jewish values. Now why? Again, being Jewish for them in today's world is a source of pride. Being part of a tribe is very important to them. This is an American phenomenon, and we happen to live in a time when being Jewish is a pretty cool thing. Just have a look at Jewish representations in popular culture today. So they're the pluses for us. But almost unanimously they said they will marry someone that they love, and they will bring up a family and raise them in a Jewish way according to the values that they thought were important. You also need to remember sociologically, this is a generation that is not actually rebelling against their parents. They're actually accepting many of the values that their parents are actually holding as well. So some of those answers were more reflective of their parents as well. I imagine it's less about organizations to do for them, which is important. Yeah, they don't care about organizations. They do not care about your building. They do not care about your membership drive. They do not care about your denomination. They care about what you offer them that's going to help them succeed in life today. And this is a really important choice, which you're going to have to make, is how much you want to acquiesce to their inclinations. So there's a good question here about parents, which is really important. I'll say a couple of things in general about parents. Firstly, in the general understanding about the way tradition is transmitted in families, the role of the mother is extremely, extremely important and far outweighs the role of the father. I also do want to acknowledge here in this study and in other studies that have been conducted in similar ethnic groups that the role of the grandparent, and especially the role of the grandmother, is also extremely, extremely important. Most teens were saying that they were expressing similar values to that of their parents. This does not mean that you want to start creating teen parent programming to try and get them involved. But I would say you do want to do a better job of engaging parents in what you're doing, because ultimately they will become your greatest advocates. Because by and large we saw that although the peer group is the number one important factor in determining whether a teen will actually participate in a Jewish activity or not, the role of the parent is vitally important in dropping them off, in paying for it, and being supportive of that as they move forward. And that's a major change in some of the other research that's been conducted, which tended to dismiss the role of the parent. Here I want to emphasize the role of the parent as being critically important for Jewish engagement. I'll try and just nuance this piece about whether you label something as Jewish or not. In their mind, it doesn't matter how you label something. Yeah, a value is a positive value no matter what. If they think it's going to be attributed to their Jewish tribalness, that's fine, but they might also associate it with something else. But these values become human for them as much as anything else, and it's worth noting that. And again, I just repeated before because it came up over and over again. Our teens are not. I was going to say not stupid, which is accurate, but they are very, very intelligent and very, very critical. And therefore, anything that's disguised to try and be some sort of like ambush or a switch and bait type scenario, like let's get them to do something and then afterwards like we'll reveal that it's been this major Jewish performance, is something that they are averse to, and they probably will not come back as a result of that because they feel like they've been duped. They're very, very big into authenticity. It's a word which appears over and over again in their lexicon. We're reaching the end point of the webinar, and I know this is only a mechanism to try and spur some sort of thinking. Again, the full report is online, but I would like to leave you with 3 questions. What in this report has been confirmed for you? And I say this really importantly because I know a lot of you on the line today work with Jewish youth today, and I'm going to assume that for many of you, a lot of this research was not new. That's important. It means you're doing a good job, and it means you're in tune with your audience. But I'm also going to assume that some of what's been included in this research is not the norm or the normative understanding for people that you work with or for. And therefore, what is it in this report that you need to take to people in your organization, in your networks, in your social circles, in your professional circles, to help confirm for them what you already know? What in this report has surprised you? And as the primary researcher on this report, and I want to acknowledge the support that I had by my colleagues, especially Justin Rosen-Smolin and Jamie Patesh, there was a lot which surprised me, and I've been doing this work now for several decades. But what has surprised you? And 3, who in your orbit do you need to bring this report to? Who do you need to put this in front of to show them and wake them up to say, there's a new reality out there, and we need to acknowledge this? There are plans in the works for future studies, for future research to be conducted. I can say that research is something in the Jewish community which has not always been normative. It is expensive. But we do plan on rolling out future studies as a result of this work, not just in general, but also getting specific in some of the subject areas that we have spoken about today. I want to finish with one quote which has guided me throughout my work with Jewish teenagers, which I think is really important and really summarizes a lot of what's taking place in my thinking as we produce this report today. It's by Janusz Korczak, who many of you know as a hero of the Holocaust, and in this week I particularly wanted to acknowledge him, who was the head of the orphanage in Warsaw Ghetto, and ultimately in 1942 was taken to his death in a dignified way with many of the children of the orphanage to Treblinka. But Janusz Korczak was also a very, very famous educator, poet, author, writer. And he wrote the following, which I think is an appropriate way to finish off today's webinar. Children are not the people of tomorrow, but are people of today. They have a right to be taken seriously and to be treated with tenderness and respect. They should be allowed to grow into whoever they were meant to be. The unknown person inside of them is our hope for the future. I'd like to thank everybody for participating in today's webinar. I'd like to think that this report can be a provocation and incitement to more discussions. Feel free to contact myself or my colleagues at the Jewish Education Project to engage in more dialogue. The report's fully available online with a whole lot of ancillary documents which give you a bit more background of how we got to all of these conclusions. And I really hope that together we can engage in this holy work and really make a difference to the lives of these teens today. Thank you very much for participating, and I wish everybody good luck and the best today as you move forward. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.